We got asked this week from people who are patrons of ours and therefore have access to the Discord server. You've described religion as a Chesterton's fence. Given the impact of genuine belief, do you think the fence is removed without believing that it is actually true, even if keeping some traditions? In other words, is it reductionist thinking to just take the traditions without the belief? If so, how have you resolved this? It's a great question.
It is an excellent question.
And I think maybe just before jumping into the question, we should say, as we have many times before, what Chesterton's fence is. So this is the observation by G.K. Chesterton in 1929, I think, that if you have two people walking along and they run into a fence and one of them says, I'll get rid of it, it's my way. The other one, and all of us should say, you should not be allowed to get rid of a fence until you can tell me what its purpose is. Simply finding that it is currently in your way is not sufficient reason. You need to be able to tell me what its function was and what it's supposed to be before we can even consider having the conversation about whether or not it no longer has the function that it was intended to have. So in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, we talk about the very many ways that Chesterton's fence shows up in modernity. Chesterton's appendix, Chesterton's breast milk, and Chesterton's religions.
Right. So basically, this is a hedge against the problem of, to the extent that you have solved or partially solved a problem, you may not realize that that's what you've done because the problem is not there in evidence. And so removing the solution will regenerate the problem.
Right.
I'm at the moment thinking about defunding the police, right? Because
Chesterton's police.
Because some cops are bastards, right? Yes, Chesterton's cops is what it is, because the fact is you have no idea how much crime isn't happening because the police do function until you remove them, which we are now seeing all over the place, predictably enough.
Well, some cops are bastards and some protesters are bastards. Both things are true.
Both things are simultaneously true. Mm-hmm. All right. So to the Discord question. The question really, if I can sum it up, is if religions are compendiums of ancient wisdom, as we argue that they are, prescriptive, and you remove the part where you actually believe in a sky god, let's say, and you just keep the traditions, right? That thou shalt not this, and treat other people this way. Have you violated the Chesterton's fence provision or not? If you throw out the belief but not the structures, and I would say it is very much a mixture, right? That the fact is there's certain aspects of religion that only work because of people's belief, right? So to the extent that a lot of that thou shalt not stuff comes with a threat, if thou ends up in a lake of fire, right? That's a very strong motivator, because the point is, who decides if you get in a lake of fire? Well, it's the sky god who you can't get away from, right? And so it is built such that a true believer actually is held back in a way that somebody who is not a true believer, sufficient, an atheist, for example, might find leeway. And the two of them in competition, the atheist will outcompete the believer in a market because they will avail themselves of opportunities that are forbidden, etc. So there's a way. Some of the structures absolutely require belief. And some of the structures are just simply, descriptions of things so that a non-believer who simply enacts the tradition will get the benefit. So like Lent, for example, right? If Lent is a mechanism for people to break an addiction, right? And the idea is everybody knows what it is that's harming you that you can't stop doing. And you get around to Lent and you say, all right, I'm going to not do that during Lent, right? That doesn't require that you believe that a sky god is watching you, unless you're going to violate your own rule and imagine that you held to it. But, Sober October is a kind of secular Lent-like behavior, and lots of people who don't believe in a sky god involve themselves in it and succeed in getting through a month. So anyway, it's a mixture of things that do work without belief and don't. But the final thing I'll say, and then I'll let you jump in here, is that does not mean you can't solve it with a compartmentalization.
Yeah.
Right?
This is kind of where I was going to go, yeah.
Right. So lots of people, this is rampant in Judaism, is there are all kinds of Jews who have some kind of a complex relationship with the metaphysical part of the belief structure, to the extent that if you ask them what they believe, what you get back doesn't allow you to figure it out, right? That the point is there's some internal structure that does sort of functionally believe in a deity, but, practical structure that doesn't include it in the analysis of analytical things. And so there are ways it can be made to hybridize.
Yes, and I think actually I'm not sure this works, but as you were talking, I was thinking when we were talking about higher ed, we're talking about the locus of control, and asking, trying to educate people so that if their locus of control was external, that it came to be internal. And so people actually had not just the agency, but the motivation to find their true selves and to those true selves be true. But I wonder about the locus of belief. I wonder about speaking, in the sort of language of locus of control, if we can't, in a more secular 21st century, to which we all belong, whether or not you have you understand yourself to have faith in a God or not, that many of us have effectively moved the locus of belief from an external sort of sky god character to actually I need to honor those morals and principles that I have described for myself, because I will not be able to sleep. I will not be able to live with myself. I will not be able to face my loved ones and my friends if I don't do what is honorable and good. And it's it moves the locus of belief from a totally abstract, never seen force to, yes, it's still abstract and never seen inside, but it brings you closer to the thing. And I'm reminded, and I think we've probably told this story on this podcast before, but I'm reminded of us being in Madagascar in 1993, I guess it would have been, right before we started grad school. This was our after college trip that our parents were generous enough to pay for us to go on. And instead of going on a tour of Europe, we went to Madagascar. And at one point, at the end of I think it was like a 670 kilometer trip across the southern part of Madagascar, which took, if that number is right, 67 hours, whatever it was. We had an average speed of 10 kilometers an hour for more than 2 days, really quite exhausting. And on that taxi Bruce ride, we ended up making the acquaintance of a young man who invited us to have dinner with his family once we got to our destination, a day or two later after we had managed to clean all of the dust off of ourselves. I'm
not sure I've fully cleaned all the dust off.
Yeah, you may. I was noticing a little bit behind that one ear. Oh, still.
It's a diminishing returns problem. I'll never quite get there.
Well, forever after, we are a little bit made of Malagasy dust, a little bit red, very iron rich. But so we were invited to the home of this Malagasy judge and her family, and they spoke some English, and they were fluent in French, and I spoke some French. We didn't speak any Malagasy. But in talking with them, we were having
I also speak some French, but it just doesn't make sense.
That's pretty true. Yeah. We, at some point, and I don't remember the run up to this, but they asked us what religion we were. And I said we didn't have any religion. And the mood in the room changed immediately. And I remember it, and maybe this is just a sort of a cartoonish memory, is that they sort of like backed off of, away from us across the table. And it became clear that things were now fairly tense and that they weren't actually sure that they could trust us. And these, this was maybe an hour or more into the conversation. We were breaking bread with them. Well, Malagasy, we were breaking rice with them. But suddenly we were very, very different. And it wasn't just that they didn't know what to make of people who didn't claim a religion. It was, and this became clear in the conversation that then ensued, that one of them asked us, and I think it may have been the judge herself, said, how is it then that you can be trusted to make the right decisions? Right? And what, as I remember, what we said in response was, we are beholden to our own morality, and understand that we would not be able to live with ourselves, and also that we have the eyes of each other, that everyone needs to have the eyes of someone's they're in their family on them, willing to say, not just willing but obliged to say if they are breaking their own sense of values and ethics, actually that wasn't the right thing to do.
Yes, although, it's funny, that event, I remember it quite vividly. And I have more sympathy with their perspective
now than you did.
Right. I mean, there is a point to be made on both sides. There's certainly many, many people like you and me who have replaced the sky god structure that keeps you in line with some other structure that keeps you in line, right? And not perfectly for anybody, whether you're a sky god believer. That's what confession is presumably about, is people repeatedly screwing up and needing to, wipe the slate clean. But the point is, I'm not sure that part of what we're seeing in the breakdown of civilization isn't that we crossed some threshold and the number of believers has dropped. And so the change in the way people monitor their own morality, right? If the market is sort of taking the place of a guide, right? Well, then you do, I don't know what exactly you do get a kind of hedonistic view. And, we are now watching, as the police have been defunded, we are watching, there was sort of a grace period where lots of people still continued to behave as they had behaved because they were in the habit of behaving that way. But people are beginning to discover that certain things aren't being enforced. And if they're not being enforced, some people will continue not to do them because they should be enforced. And some people will say, well, if they're not being enforced. Yeah,
it was actually the enforcement that was keeping me in line. And that's a problem for those people, and therefore for society that those people exist. But some people do require the external belief or force or whatever it is.
Right. And, so at some level, I think it's not a bad analogy to say that there is something about the absence of deep belief in a punishing and rewarding God that is like taking the safety off the gun, which is far from discharging the gun. Yeah. But the point is, it is one step in that chain. And so, I also think that this is one of these two-way failures of empathy, right? Where empathy, I won't make the argument here, but empathy basically is you using your own mental architecture to figure out what somebody else is going to think or do by running the data that you have about their situation through your own computer. And the point is, that works really well if your computer looks like theirs, and it works really badly if it doesn't. And in the case that it looks somewhat like it, it's somewhere in between. And I think there was a part of us that how old were we? At the
24
years old. At 24 years old, did not really understand what it was like to have lived a life that was so thoroughly religiously guided. Yeah. And then to encounter people who sounded like atheists. I do not.
You don't own that term.
I don't believe in atheists. But such a person has a hard time understanding if you know that your behavior is constrained by your belief that a sky god is not going to be too happy about you doing X, Y, or Z, then you may not understand. Well, then if I didn't have that person watching me, then I would presumably do all those things. Well, how do I know you won't? Right? Yeah. That is a failure of empathy, and then our failure to understand that actually they had a point, and maybe we are even seeing that point, expanding across civilization as we do get more secular.
Well, I mean, to be fair, though, they didn't ask us to leave.
Right.
We did come to an understanding that felt sufficient at the time.
Yep.
And no time to explore all of this today here, but it should just be noted that, so this judge and her family were asking us what religion we had, and we've said multiple times that they were religious folk in a way, not pious in the way of some say, an Italian grandmother. But what religion would it have been? They were Christian. The Christians having shown up in Madagascar sometime, presumably during the French colonial period, sometime in I don't actually know exactly when, but either late 19th or more likely or early mid 20th century. And Christianity largely replaced the traditional animist beliefs that are still in evidence. You still have, for instance, turning of the bone ceremonies, which I was lucky enough to attend one of these, and in which the ancestors are disinterred on a regular basis and talked to, depending on which tribe it is.
They're caught up. They're brought up to speed.
They're brought up to speed on what's happened. And as I've noted elsewhere, they're brought up to speed on births and marriages and the harvest, and they're probably not brought up to speed explicitly on who's died because presumably the ancestors already know that.
Yeah,
right? Yeah, they're hanging out with the other people who've died since last they spoke. But anyway, there's still animist traditions in many regards in evidence across all of Madagascar, but most people now call themselves Christians, and certainly this family was Christian.